So thank you everyone for joining this evening. I know it's a really interesting time all over the world right now, and it's great that we've been able to adapt physical meetups to virtual meetups. It just shows like the ability of change and the ability of this industry sector with distributed teams, etc. So yeah, a bit about, we're really excited to have Tezos UK here and Simon from the team. So a bit about WeWork FinTech Blockchain Labs, who are hosting this. We're WeWork's vertical focused incubator for FinTech and blockchain startups. We essentially help early stage startups in the FinTech and blockchain sector with mentorship, workshops, raising capital, events, etc. So really excited to have Simon and Tezos UK here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. So yes, this is our first online meetup. I hope the first of many to come. And also pretty decent turnout considering the circumstances as well. I mean, everyone is still adjusting. I just wanted to say a few words before I hand over to Nick. So as I have said, I am based here in Cambridge at the moment. I get the luxury of going to a number of conferences. And of course, they are, you get the ones that are blockchain based and maybe 10, 20 professors in one spot all talking about fundamentals of technology and what impact this will have on society. But what struck me most was the lack of discussion when it comes to incentives and governance. This is not something that even these forums that do attract this caliber of university, because it is so new. So we are fortunate in Tezos to actually look into governance seriously. We are the first chain to have on-chain governance built in. And we're also still trying to figure out what governance means within the context of blockchains. So we are very privileged to have Dr. Nick Almond here tonight. I'll let him introduce himself. And this, I hope, will be enlightening for everybody. So please, everyone, welcome Dr. Nick Almond.
Thank you very much, Simon. Solo round of applause. Right, I'm going to try and share my screen, see what happens. Right. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we got it.
On my slides. Fantastic. Right. So, my talk is called Politics, Voting and Governance 2.0. My goal for this is to trying to get everyone somewhat up to speed on the terminology used when talking about governance. I think it's very applicable to the blockchain space. People kind of use the words in the blockchain space thinking it kind of just applies to blockchains, when in fact, obviously, there's been a few hundred years of organizational development where people come at it from a very sort of meat space point of view. So that's where I've come from. Essentially, I want to give you an overview of where I think governance is going, both in the blockchain space, but also out in the real world. I think it's worth talking about the context now and how this is going to influence governance decisions, particularly technologically. I'm going to define some bits. Essentially, the goal of what I wanted to share with you today is some ideas I've been developing for quite some time, which is to develop a kind of framework for understanding how blockchains do governance. And I want us to have a conversation about what you think Tezos is like in that framework. So the goal is to create an analytical framework and then apply it to blockchains. And I'm going to do a bit of that, and hopefully we can get a bit discursive at the end. And ultimately, I think basically governance is due a giant upgrade in blockchains, but also just generally in organizations. So my background, this was my kit that I did my PhD on, lots of shiny things. I spent a lot of time firing lasers at that stuff. I'm a physicist by background, and that's kept me kind of numerical and applied maths. I taught maths for a bit, which is where I got into blockchain by teaching cryptography. I taught number theory and cryptography, but sort of got captured by the social sciences for the last 10 years or so. And I'm now an associate dean of teaching and learning. And as part of that job, it's my job to kind of lead a group of academics towards being better at teaching. The phrase herding cats is very applicable when it comes to academics. And it's when you throw the students in, it's like the cats have had kittens, and it's a complete chaos, right? It's just very, very difficult to lead a group of people who fundamentally believe in total agency. So agency is a kind of term I'm going to use in a bit, but academic freedom is a fundamental principle of the way that universities run. So actually, they're very much like decentralized organizations. So I've got super interested in this for a while, and I research in governance systems, blockchains, token economics, and also learning theory. So I'm kind of interested about where the crossovers are in each of these things. So why I think blockchains are interesting. So I think they fundamentally, I think they promise to fundamentally reimagine what we can do at scale. So for many, many years, thousands of years, in fact, we've organized into sort of clusters to try and do stuff together. But blockchains allow us to do this literally globally. We're producing shared outcomes in a way that's never been achievable at scale before. And it does that through essentially governance. It does it through managing incentives and building networks that people adopt. It allows us to create our own money. This is where the token economics comes in. I think it's quite interesting. States kind of had a monopoly on this for a while, but now essentially anyone can make their own money. And that creates a mess in some places, but it's also kind of useful. We can build our own organizations now. Typically, you would have to wait for somebody with lots of capital to set up an organization. Now you can spin up a DAO pretty quickly and start to coordinate with people at scale in trust minimized environments. It allows us to communicate and transact, and no one can stop us. And I think this is where blockchains get interesting, is the degree to which we can do some productive outcome without anyone stopping us. And it's super early. And this is important, right? Because if you're analyzing something and you're looking to get some traction in an early field, you're looking for essentially untouched conceptual ground, of which I think there's loads in the blockchain space. So I personally think we're super early, but potentially about to get a bit later in the curve. So yes, here's the context. We're potentially all doomed. I don't think it's as bad as it could be. This virus is definitely going to change the world. So things are going to radically change. Socially, economically, technologically, and pretty much everything else that you can imagine is about to go through what's called a critical phase transition. That is, instead of a kind of gradual change, we've just basically changed state as a civilization almost overnight. And what I think that means is happening, and I've thought this for a long time anyway, is that we're entering an era of decentralization. So we've been kind of on this transition for kind of a while. We started as people fairly decentralized. It was almost like happenstance that we would sort of cluster into things. We would form little groups. Our native state is to be kind of tribal beings in little clustered, localized chunks. But essentially what you can get done is pretty limited in these little isolated chunks. And what people discovered was that with a bit of centralization, you could do some pretty mad stuff. And with that, you can create power structures. So with power structures, you can get people to do what you want for them. And therefore, you get a whole load of efficiency in terms of creating productive outcomes, like pyramids or whatever. So we started decentralized, and progressively, for the last, well, particularly in the last 70 or 80 years, we went a bit mad with it. We discovered that centralized systems allowed us to create radical efficiency. And with that, we created lots and lots of new value. You can look at essentially the consumption of world goods and the output of things has essentially gone completely parabolic, exponential since about 1950. The rate of expansion has been crazy, and that's because we use centralized systems. And now we're here. All of the systems that we've developed are now probably not fit for purpose. Most of these things require us to sit in office blocks, working together, co-locating, collaborating in ways that best suit centralized systems. And I imagined that the sort of transition into a more decentralized world would take place over the course of the next 10 or 20 years. And it's likely to happen a lot quicker now, because we've just had to start to think about how we function as a decentralized group of people. The slight issue is that the technologies that might enable this, I mean, the good thing is we've got a chance of creating decentralized technologies because we've been working on them for more than 10 years now. But in essence, they're still an emerging technology. And the way to think about emerging technology is that they get better exponentially over time. So here's a kind of technology that's kind of iterating. It's an established thing. It's improving over time. You can probably equate one of these as like Moore's law. And then somewhere down here, there's a technology that's out there but not really being used yet because it's not got very good performance. They're slow, they're clunky, the UX is horrible. Only the innovators are using them. And then all of a sudden, something triggers an event which causes a rapid adoption. And I think that is likely to happen over the next 12 months or so with some decentralized technologies. It's a trajectory we've been on for quite some time, right? People have been talking about digital transformation as a thing that organizations should do. But right now, every major organization and institution is having to with digital technologies, because that's what allows us to work remotely. That's what allows us to have our processes not take place in a building where we have to co-locate. The problem is that we've generally done digital transformation really badly. We've got things like shared calendars, but we just clog them up with stuff. We've got data sharing functionality, but we just use PDFs, which are flattened, dead documents that can't be used. And we've largely just done it without really thinking strategically and without thinking about where governance plays into it. So I think it's worth saying that governance is important. I've defined it a little bit. I've recovered it a couple of times. But it's got this kind of weird circular definition. So governance is the process of governing. And if you look this up, you get back to governance. It's a kind of slippery concept. You find out when you're on an interesting concept when people have been arguing about what it means for hundreds of years, and that's the case with governance. There's a few different ways of thinking about it. I think it's making decisions about decision making. So it's decision making generally, but that can happen in isolation. So how you build structures around decision making that happens. it's fundamentally an interplay between structure and control. So structure being what is the framework we all agree that we work within, and control being the obvious, you get told what to do. You are, there's something to comply to. It's also a kind of way of controlling complexity. So you can think of an organization with very strict governance processes, like a biscuit factory, for example, where you want biscuits. I don't want anything but hobnobs to come out of this. So you want high structure, high control, because you want predictable outcomes. But in some cases, you want a lot more emergent complexity to come out of it, in which case you have more stringent rules. And largely, you're looking at interplay between these two kinds of structures, between hierarchical structures and more horizontal, decentralized structures. But largely, you can start to call it collective action coordination and think about how you can upgrade things. I'm going to run through a few case studies now about how I think governance varies between the blockchains. But if anyone's got any questions or anything so far, feel free to throw them in the chat. Find out where you are. Anyone in the chat? Right. I'm going to keep going. If anyone wants to jump in, let one of the panelists can turn on their mics. Okay. So I'm going to apply this to Bitcoin. Bitcoin's obviously becoming radically more relevant at the moment. I think we're in the process of printing around $4 trillion more at the moment. And nothing in the world exists like Bitcoin and its monetary policy. It was kind of built for this. So as banks start to get risky, people are going to start looking at Bitcoin. But what really you want to look at is, to what degree could you build a future on this? So to me, Bitcoin is a decentralized financial organization. It's a coordinated approach to building money. It's an organization that does money, essentially. And the participants in this organization are miners, users, nodes, developers, institutions. There's these various stakeholders that are all part of this organization. And what makes it interesting is that people come in and out of this. I think Bitcoin is as decentralized as it gets, really. I think it's, and there's a sort of here, there's a bit of a caveat, because there's points in it where there is real issues with centralization. So, as many of you'll know, the miners form, I think there's 3 or 4 large pools that, if they colluded, could in fact start editing the chain, start rolling back the chain. In fact, this was even mooted as a solution to the Binance hack. It's highly technocratic, and by that I mean, if it was a society, that it would be controlled by a small number of highly technically minded people who understand how to manipulate the rule base. And it's hyper conservative, and I think it probably won't upgrade much. But what's interesting about it, if it was an organization, there is a sort of hierarchy here. And the developers at the top makes it technocratic, but there is no leadership. Satoshi did the right thing, disappeared. Ethereum is slightly different. It's fair to say it's second in the blockchain race, although things might start tumbling around in the next few months. I like to consider it essentially the research chain. I think there's some incredibly interesting work happening at the fringes of consensus protocols. I think there's really interesting work happening in cryptography, zero-knowledge proofs, and it's got the most research, and it's pushing the most boundaries in the blockchain space, to my opinion. I think it's got real adoption. It's got a thriving use case set, some of which are dying a death a little bit. The DeFi narrative, if you like, is just taking a real nosedive. It does upgrade, but it does so very slowly. I think Vitalik was expecting ETH 2.0 to launch in 2016 or thereabouts, and I'm not expecting it for quite some time. I think it's got a fairly emergent governance structure, but I think what's interesting about it, I think it's potentially even too decentralized for its own good. What's happening with the network there is that people are kind of running off in lots of different directions, and there's kind of pretty limited centralized control over the direction of the launch of the next phase of the network. So I actually think its future is fairly unknown. The Ethereum Foundation, something's going on towards the top, and I'm not sure it's entirely clear what's going on. EOS. I don't know if anyone recognizes the picture here. This is from the movie Big Short. I mean, this was essentially the trade of the century and turned a profit of about 2.6 billion. Still doesn't hold a candle to the EOS raise. They generated lots of money. This is what they've got going for them, I guess. It's kind of regulatory ambiguous moment, although they've managed to scare off the SEC. It has an interesting consensus mechanism in the sense that it uses delegated proof of stake, but it does have a very limited validator set of 21 block producers, which themselves already seem to be colluding with one another. And at the moment, it's very difficult to even send transactions on the network. And it's got fairly low user and developer adoption, with this kind of strange pseudo-constitutional politics. That is Tezos. I'll admit, I'm fairly new to Tezos. I've been researching it fairly intensely over the last couple of months. I think the liquid proof of stake mechanism is very interesting. It's quite close to the Cardano model. I think there's something interesting there. I think there's a kind of interesting esoteric language to Tezos. It took me a while to get my head around roles and cycles and bakers and all these kind of things. I think that's quite an interesting approach to take. Definitely creates a kind of in-crowd vibe. I would say it's leading the way with on-chain governance, and it has a kind of good engagement for the most part. I think it's a pretty early network, and not everyone can be a validator. So unlike Bitcoin, where anyone can essentially spin up a node who has an internet connection and a device to do it, there's a slightly more there's a bigger financial barrier to it. So I think it does successfully upgrade, and the recent Carthage update shows that. If I was critical, I would say the society, it would be fairly aristocratic. Essentially, anyone holding Tez is to some degree subservient to these bakers who do the voting and sort of validating for them. I think that's kind of an interesting place to be, and is actually kind of largely where society started to move, and in certain cases many still are. I won't dig into what blockchains can do. I'm sure you're fairly well familiar with them. I think where I want to go now is, if you were thinking about upgrading these things, I think we're in a process where organizations are going to need blockchains to allow themselves to function and process in this kind of new decentralized world. I think there's still a lot to do. I'm going to cover some of these in a bit. But I think we've got some very open questions where blockchains can go. And if we want to start to build systems that move beyond the purely digital world, I think it's fair to say at the moment most of these crypto networks exist in a kind of tangential digital world and aren't really influencing most organizations yet. I think it gets interesting when these systems start to be integrated into real practice in real organizations, which I believe is one of the targets of Tezos. So one of the areas that I wanted to talk about, the talk is called Politics and Voting. And the way I like to look about governance in blockchain systems is from the lens of power. So I think you can basically define power as there's politics as the negotiation of power. I like basically to find definitions that I think are as simple as they can get. And I think politics is the negotiation of power, where power is the ability to get things done, right? So power is just, I can do stuff. So you'll find powerful governance, powerful governments have good governance. And I don't think anyone has sort of cracked it yet. Governance applies to all organizations, and I consider blockchains organizations. So I consider the Bitcoin blockchain to be an organization of sorts, financial organization. So I would say, right, governance, if we were to define that, then it's the politics of organizations and institutions. In other words, it's the process of getting things done collectively. I'm going to quickly look, see if anyone's got any questions. Where's my thing now? I've lost my pop-up. Right, I'm going to keep going. Put some questions in the chat if you've got any. I think it's wise to consider this, to consider decentralization and governance on a continuum between centralized and decentralized. I actually think this makes more sense than the left-right political paradigm sorts. So, yeah, I think we're going to start to see a movement down this continuum, and potentially even a tear in half, right? So I think we're going to see things that are more centralized and more decentralized. And what we need to find is a way of analyzing this stuff. Right, so what I've tried to create, and I really want your thoughts on this developing piece of work, is can we create a governance framework, an analysis framework for understanding and designing blockchain-based governance solutions? So I think a lot of companies and centralized organizations are going to want to introduce decentralized tech. I think what we need is a lens into understanding how they work. So I think we can, and remember the kind of Hinman.
Sorry, Nick, could you please repeat that last bit because your internet connection is unstable?
It might be your headphones, Nick. No.
No, Bill.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're back.
Ah, brilliant. Built-in mic's working. Headphones died. Right, okay. So openness and transparency is the first one. So this is one of the things that I think blockchains have genuinely brought to the world that didn't exist before.
is the ability to build radically transparent systems. So what we've got essentially, it starts at this ledger, the history of transactions. But when you're talking about governance processes, it extends beyond that to how do network upgrades appear? Who decides what the upgrades are and how are they formulated? So how open is the decision making? Can everyone get involved? And is the chain genuinely immutable? So obviously this isn't always the case. There is a way to selectively edit transactions. I think this is one of the lenses into it. So for me, openness and transparency. So this is a criteria. This is my definition of it. Let me know if you sort of disagree or agree. Openness, the degree to which the provenance of decision making is transparent, open, and participatory. So if a decision has been made, where has it come from, and could you have got involved? So yeah, I think there's a point here. Yeah, it's a liquid democracy thing. Smart contracts carried out on chain. That is important for transparency. So the lens I want you to think about here is, so take Carthage, for example. Where did it come from, and were you aware of it from the get-go? Did you see it coming? Did you have an influence on what it is, where it goes? That would play into this criteria. Next point is agility and upgradeability. So a major outcome of quality governance is your ability to get things done. So that includes upgrading to some new protocol function if you want it to, or the ability to respond to unexpected events. We've just seen this happen on a societal level. So you can see some countries have been able to pivot into entirely new ways of functioning rather more easily than others. And that influenced the degree to which our lockdowns have happened everywhere. So I can make decisions quickly and put them into practice. And it's a kind of payoff space, right? So the other part of this is how much sort of network throughput, its productivity as well. I think agility forms into that. So I think the lens here is to what degree can the network upgrade through necessary or desirable network upgrades, and how can they be suggested to and accepted by the network? So if we want to get something done, can you get the network to accept it quickly? And I think this is a really important lens on blockchain. So the other one, decentralization. People use this term quite badly, I would say, across the space. I think it's fairly well misunderstood. And people kind of just presume it's a little bit more simple than it is. It's not, there's no single definition of it yet. There's no legally accepted definition of decentralization. And generally, and this is somewhat controversial in the blockchain space, too much of it is generally a bad idea. But not as bad as too much centralization is the kind of point there. It's worth unpacking why you would want decentralization. In genuinely decentralized systems, there's differing degrees of control. So if you're in an organization and this is the x-axis here, this bit of research says that situation control is how much control you have over something. In decentralized systems, you have a lot. In centralized systems, you have very little. And this y-axis is how innovative things are. So here you can see that innovation kind of trends towards some maximum. And then the more decentralized things get, the less innovative things become. So there's a kind of sweet spot for it. What's super important at the moment is the degree to which decentralized systems are made anti-fragile. And if people haven't come across Nassim Taleb's work on this, strongly advise having a look at it. He wrote a series of books, which he calls his Inserto series. And anti-fragile systems are systems that when there's a shock, they don't just die, they get better. So some systems are fragile, some resilient, and some anti-fragile. And I think decentralized systems are anti-fragile systems. But if I'm going to sort of pose here a definition for decentralization, I'm open to anyone sort of pulling it apart. But for me, it's the degree to which power and agency is distributed to network participants. How much in the system is the power given back to the people, essentially? And agency is the ability to do what you want. How much do you have the ability to do what you want on the network? The more decentralized you are, the more ability you have to actually do whatever you want. A couple more, then we'll open up for discussion. I think permissionlessness is a really important part of this, and that's the degree to which there is censorship resistant on the network. This means that anyone can take part. It means that anyone can be a validator. And there's quite a lot of challenges to permissionlessness in the blockchain space at the moment, including things like KYC, intermediating parties like exchanges. These actors can stop people from joining in, even if the network itself is permissionless. So, and I think that if I was to define this, and this is what I'm least happy with at the moment, is the degree to which network rules limit access. So, to what degree does the network stop you from getting involved? That's its degree of permissionlessness. The other one is to what degree is the network self-sustainable? So networks with good governance aren't just resilient, they're resilient for a long time. This is a key point. If the creators are still necessary, the governance isn't good enough yet. The end game for all decentralized networks is that the creators disappear. And that's a sort of really important part of it. And communities should be able to self-organize around the protocol. And for that to happen, there needs to be a process for educating people in the protocol itself. So how well does new participants get brought into the network and made constructive participants of it? So for me, self-sustainability is really important to the degree to which the network can maintain functionality for an indefinite period. So it's not just good now, it's good for a long time in the future. Finally, I think a way of appraising the governance of systems is, has the network been able to realize an asset for itself, a monetary system, with a stable network accepted monetary policy? So obviously Bitcoin's winning on this one. It has the greatest economic bandwidth, the greatest liquidity, and a very well accepted, almost ideologically accepted monetary policy. And it also needs sufficient adoption to realize that monetary base. So yeah, I think this is a really important point. Once you have economic bandwidth, I think this is the degree to which the network's assets are maintained, distributed, and utilized. So it's not just that I've created a money, it's that I'm distributing that money to the network participants and they're using it to develop the network. That's how good economic bandwidth works. Right, so I've got to a point here where I've created a kind of list of criteria where the governance of a network could be evaluated. And now I'm interested in us having a bit of a conversation about where we think Tezos sits on this framework. So let's have a quick chat about that. I don't know if you want to throw some points into the chat box here. If anyone's got points on any of the criteria. So Mark said the challenges you see is identity and visibility of any of the governance decisions. Identity is a really crucial piece, actually, and I'm not sure it's well enough articulated in here. But the visibility of governance decisions, I would say, falls into this. the degree to which the provenance of decision-making is transparent, open, and participatory. So what do we think, Tezos, for example, what's the functionality within it that creates openness and transparency? So Simon said the identity is fluid just as governance. Greater engagement over a certain protocol or transaction builds identity. I agree. I think identity, would probably fall within maybe into the permissionless bucket. I think identity doesn't really matter in permissionless systems. I think these are payoff spaces, right? So if a network requires identity differentiation, it necessarily becomes less permissionless. Because what you're saying is that some people are more important than others, and that makes it less permissionless. But what you gain potentially is agility and upgradeability. So yeah, I think Matt, good point. Degree of fair participation, I would say probably falls within, yeah, I think that needs to be incorporated actually. The degree to which participation is in there. Have we got yeah, so here, participatory, I would say is a key point. So yeah, how do we measure participation? I think the amount at which, so I know in Tezos, you've had a recent vote which had something like 85% turnout, but the degree to which that was participatory is how much the coin holders themselves got to influence the vote, or was it just the bakers? I don't, you might know this better. Was it the bakers or the coin holders that ultimately had the say?
I'll just answer this over mic.
Yeah.
The way Tezos works is that bakers, I actually mentioned it in the chat, but anybody can run a Tezos node and be an active participant. However, to participate in upgrades or consensus, you have to be a baker.
Yes.
That's just the rules of Tezos at the moment. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, the what's interesting about blockchains is there is rules, right? So, in some sense, they're quite authoritarian spaces, but it's not a person with opinions using those rules. It's a network. It's at the protocol level. So, and this is part of the permissionlessness piece. What makes these networks interesting is that you can either play the game or not. So if you don't like the game, you just don't play it. You go play on another network where you like the rules. So in Tezos, I would say there's probably, I would say, the highest degree of participation in any blockchain that I can think of, but it's still not perfect in the sense that coin voters are delegating their power to a smaller number, much smaller set of validators. So Matt's saying in real world governance, voters no representation holds up ethos and voice their concerns. Is there a need for community slashing requirements in blockchain governance? Yeah, so I think this is part of the permissionlessness piece. So if there are slashing requirements, that's saying that the network has rules that limits access, right? So if someone doesn't play by the rules, then you're permissioned in the sense that you are removed from the network. But all blockchains do this, essentially. Bitcoin does it slightly more through economic incentives, in the sense that if you want to try and corrupt the network, you need to try and gain 51% of the hashing power. I'm not sure on Tezos to what degree. How do you get slashed? Don't want to jump in on that one.
I can also answer that. So if there are a couple of situations, for example, if you are double baking, this can actually be a technical issue with running your validator node, your baker. So you're essentially broadcasting the wrong what is it? I'm just trying to explain double baking in a way that makes sense, but okay.
Is it using the same stake to validate twice?
Yes. So if you end up, basically, yeah.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you are sending the wrong answer to the network,
yeah,
then you are double baking, and therefore you end up getting slashed. But you as the baker take that responsibility.
Yeah.
So you as the baker also lose your bond and your security deposit. So governance actually it's the it lies with the baker, in fact.
Yeah. So in
the community doesn't get slashed.
So
although the baker might take it out on the community, but that's a different discussion. Then the community wouldn't necessarily have to trust that baker, for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, most systems are not permissionless. I think this is again one of the things that blockchains do. There's always limits to what you can do within a system. So if you're looking at a societal level, there are laws that you have to, and there's a very complex set of laws that you must follow. Blockchains try to minimize these to maximize permissionlessness. So if we were analyzing, say, Tezos on this, and I want to see if we can reach a little bit of light agreement, I would say there's your kind of mid to high on openness and transparency. I think that one of the I don't know, what do people think that, so there is a foundation and there is decisions made for the network. Are all decisions obvious and open? Don't know if anyone wants to throw anything in the chat.
Well, I mean, I don't, of course, represent the Tezos Foundation, but what I can say is they act more like a treasury.
Yes.
More like a accountability layer for the distribution of funds from the fundraiser.
Yeah. So, and so the foundation model is quite interesting and certainly become a sort of paradigm across the crypto space, mainly because Ethereum did it for a raise and didn't go to jail after they did it. So a lot of people jumped on after it. And I think the ultimate end goal is can you move to a point where you've got a foundation-like structure which has a treasury function that's essentially completely automated, and every decision and every asset that's moved from that has a clear provenance chain to it. I think that's the end game of openness and transparency. So you can look at where you think Tezos is on that. Agility and upgradeability. So on this one, you've just upgraded successfully. So you've done, is it 3 upgrades now?
Yes.
3?
Athens, Babylon, and now Carthage. That was
so
2.
That's about 3x more than Bitcoin in a similar amount of time. So you could argue, and in fact, I can't think of another blockchain that has upgraded 3 times in an equivalent. I think Monero manages to push upgrades every 6 months. They have an interesting governance process there. I know Ethereum's been doing sort of 1.x upgrades. How substantial were the upgrades?
So the first one, Athens, was just proving that it worked. It was quite a basic upgrade. Babylon included a number of changes, which I think were a very good experience for the network in its resilience to actually highlight the areas that did need work, that also I guess reveals certain either information from certain stakeholders as well, because we had a number of bakers drop off actually. But then there was some extra work that was created in order to resolve certain issues. So again, this is the issue with software. Software is complex, and then when you put that to a vote, how do you handle that vote? It's a very, very tricky issue. But remember that Tezos is an experiment and learning.
I mean, this is a exceptionally difficult thing to do in decentralized systems.
Yes.
So you can look at the world right now and look at which countries managed to pivot towards social isolation quickly. And they were typically countries with much more authoritarian control. Centralization allows you to upgrade and shift systems and shift practice quickly. More decentralized systems, not so much. It's harder. So the decentralization bit, I think, because there's a smaller validator set, I would say potentially that Tezos is slightly less decentralized than Bitcoin, but it's arguable. Does anyone want to argue on that point? Bitcoin or Tezos, which is the most decentralized?
I have some opinions, but I don't want to monopolize this.
If anyone wants,
go on.
Anyone else want to throw anything in?
You also want to speak, you can just raise your hand, and we can activate your mic so you can share your answer. Any takers?
I'll keep going. So I'm gonna, and feel free to throw anything in the chat if you've got any thoughts on if there's any criteria missing. Again, permissionlessness. I think we've talked about that quite a bit. To what degree is there separation between who can use the network? So essentially, if anyone can come in, they're all treated equally in the network, then it's permissionless. If there is barriers to entry, if there's criteria that people need to fall within line with, and there's implications if you don't, then it's less permissionless. Self-sustainability is the kind of one that I think is quite interesting. I think, again, Bitcoin has 11 years under its belt and probably will always remain ahead on that front. But what you're looking for is systems and processes that make blockchain self-sustainable. So this is how you're getting your adoption. How are you bringing in people to be part of a network that makes it self-sustainable? So that's how you're bringing in developers. How is the network governance situated so there is almost like succession planning? Is it going to be around in 20 years' time? And the economic bandwidth one is, it's fairly financial, but the angle I'm getting at with this is how much of the assets that generated by the network make it back to the participants. So I'm looking at ICOs with ridiculous pre-mines and things like that, how they are monopolized bandwidth, monopolized economic bandwidth that limits the control of the participants, because they're always at a financial disadvantage to the people who control it. I think someone made a point here. What do you think on the weighting of applications of economic bandwidth and protocol upgrade? These two are related, the economic bandwidth, and well, this is what I see this as what powers the governance process. The more economic bandwidth you have, the more powerful you become, the more things you can get done. So to what degree should people have weighting based on the amount of the network they control is principally one of the most important questions of blockchain governance. So what we've mostly seen is networks that use a kind of one coin, one vote principle, and the whales essentially control the network. So almost 95 to even 98% of the network is controlled by 1-2% of the coin holders. So these are sometimes, you can look at the Gini coefficient, which is the financial concentration of the tokens. If there's on-chain governance, that is really important. But you could probably argue that even with that degree of financial control, there's still still less financial centralization in the real world. So yeah, I think someone's mentioned more economic bandwidth causes more expensive staking requirements, and that mitigates attacks. Absolutely. So the network security is in fact related to the value of the tokens many of the times. I think there's a limit to where Ethereum falls over, and it's in the $5 to $10 range when there's not enough network security to make gas expensive enough. So it starts to become affordable to DDoS the network. I think in the case of Tezos, there's a rather high financial barrier to become a baker, which only gets higher the more the economic bandwidth increases. So eventually, it does end up kind of aristocratic, that the people holding these baking stakes become more and more powerful over time as the economic bandwidth grows. So their role becomes really important, and how they become accountable. So what might happen as a network develops is that these things can go up and down, and I would expect this to be a kind of dynamic thing. So the more the bandwidth, the more secure they are, for sure, if they're designed right, but it lowers things like participation and permissionlessness. Has anyone got any other thoughts on this? Any points to make across any of them? If not, I'll wrap up. We can have a...
No, I have a question about this.
Yes, mate.
I think it is, we talked about economic bandwidth and the protocol upgradeability. So we have, in a blockchain sphere, even in Tezos or any other blockchain, you have a large percentage of tokens in circulation or held up by exchanges, right? Yeah. Centralized exchanges like Binance or Coinbase, where users are holding their token there. But then how this gonna where, especially in the governance of blockchain, where you have one coin and one vote, where a user might be using multiple applications on blockchain, yes, but the user voting will be vested in this exchanges, so they're making decision.
Yes, so I think this is one of the issues with coin voting, and we just saw it with the essentially the Tron-based attack on Steemit, which I know you're familiar with, Matt. And I think this was actually blockchain governance in action. I don't think people looked at that as the failure of the protocol. For me, it's blockchain governance in action. So from what I understand is that Justin Tron got hold of the pre-mine stake from the Steemit company and colluded with the exchanges who are holding tokens on behalf of the network participants and used it to capture the network. That for me is actually blockchain governance in action. And at the moment, there's this kind of interesting debate where the community are actually trying to fork away from it. Well, that's what happens when intermediating third parties corrupt the network through collusion.
So you're suggesting, as a user who is using the smart contract-enabled blockchain, you have the governance as well at the same time. As a user, will be having more sense of ownership on the governance happening there by who can hold their tokens. Is that going to be a centralized exchange or a trusted third party they can account on, and they can take the tokens anytime they wish if there's a hostile takeover or something like that?
Absolutely. So I think if people felt true agency with their tokens, that is that I'm holding these tokens, I have an influence, I feel like I have control over something, they wouldn't have left the tokens on the exchanges and therefore had the network captured. So essentially, when if the governance is good and people feel like they can influence the network, they will participate and not give away their rights to a third party like an exchange. So I think what we need to get to is a point where people feel like they're, even if they're a small token holder, can actually influence the network. And that's kind of challenging to do with one coin, one vote. So I'm really interested in voting technologies that move away from the plutocratic model, which is one coin, one vote, which always seem to trend towards very small number of participants controlling the network, especially when there's intermediating parties like exchanges involved. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Just the only point I'll mention is that, as you say, the governance is a process, and I think with upgradeability on Tezos, then I think its governance model could also change over time.
Yeah, and this is kind of my sort of final point, really. Where I think we're going, so I mentioned governance 2.0, so I'm just going to say what I think that is. And I think there's been a very interesting narrative or development coming out of the governance space from blockchains. So we've been operating what look like pretty dusty and old models of governance, both in political systems and in organizational systems, that I genuinely think could be influenced by some of the things that are being developed in the blockchain space. So I do think radically new approaches to running organizations will emerge, in the same that what we've had is the kind of centralized world has been the kind of one part of the story, and the decentralized world is an emerging counter narrative to that. And what happens is that some blend of these two, some hybrid of these two, will create really interesting new spaces for organizing. So I think it's the hybrid of the two systems which I find interesting. I think that's what governance 2.0. Like Simon said, then this is a fluid process. So what I advise people to look at when designing governance systems on blockchain is to look at progressive decentralization. How are you slowly moving towards a decentralized model? Starting with radical decentralization is a lot of the reasons why many of the ICO projects died. They weren't actually decentralized, they were actually hyper-centralized. Only a small number of people had them, but they were trying to build what they were building with radically decentralized models. So radical decentralization isn't practical or necessary in nearly all cases. And you need to be looking at things what are obvious. And I sort of like to think about this process as a kind of iterative thing of finding this sweet spot where the right level of centralization works. This is from kind of traditional organizational theory, but I think it applies to blockchain. So this sort of progressive decentralization idea is that you have a slow movement to being more, recognize that you are centralized in places and try to improve it over time. And essentially iterate these things into organizations where it makes sense and if it's required. Slightly different for public blockchains. A kind of final point, all of these points need voting. What the big bit that I think is missing from the blockchain space is tools that enable people to signal more directly from network participants. So it's overcoming that barrier of minority token holders having literally no say in the network. How do we get essentially the crowd involved? So how do we get all of the minority token holders more directly involved in the governance of a network. And I think there's a bit of a gap there on effective voting tools that can overcome these sort of low engagement bits. So I think all of these might increase. I'm not sure, I think someone mentioned identity earlier, but I think voting tools essentially generate identity, histories of participation in the network, which could be used to generate identity layers, but that might reduce permissionlessness. And it might increase bandwidth by getting more people involved and it feeling more participatory. But it also might start throwing the network into disarray and build uncertainty. So some of these things are fairly obvious improvements with voting tech, some aren't. And I think that's pretty much everything I've got to say. So feel free to throw any questions in, or we can have an open discussion, or feel free to throw on your mics and have a chat if anyone's got anything to say.
Yeah, if anyone wants to ask a question, just raise your hand and we can add you to the panel.
Anybody?
So I think there's a raise hand button somewhere if anyone wants to jump in. Yeah, so this is a really interesting point around the challenges with voting around fake news and influence. I agree. This is one of my major concerns around voting technologies, is that you could essentially, let's say there was more direct voting based things for Tezos. So every token holder essentially could collectivize more effectively. It would, in theory, be able to mount some kind of social attack and use disinformation to persuade people to swing a negative upgrade. And I think that's a really interesting point, and there's no obvious answer to getting over it. Where I think it might be interesting is if you start looking at identity solutions, and when you can build confidence that certain actors who have been voting, even if they've got a low stake, are productive participants to the network. So there might be someone with a very low stake who's been really influential, writing codes, building communities, championing the network, and should have a higher weighted vote than people who have just bought in a stake bigger than theirs. So I think it's history of participation over time is what gets over the influence bit. It's very difficult to influence people for long periods of time. You can do it short periods of time, but longer periods of time is much harder. It's funny you should mention nation states. I'd been developing this for quite some time, and watching what's been happening in the world, it kind of applies to nation states. Normally, it's very difficult to see what a nation state is like. Quite so obviously, it requires years of analysis and political theory. But essentially, what's just happened is all the nation states in the world have essentially just thrown their cards onto the table about what they're really like. So if you're looking at the coronavirus situation, you can see that openness and transparency is clearly variable across nation states. Some are sharing data about deaths and about infection rates. Some are testing lots. Some are purposefully not testing to be less transparent. You can see there's a real continuum there. The ability for countries to essentially move to these new ways of working, of decentralized ways of working, is this agility and upgradeability bit. The countries that are more decentralized are going to struggle with this. So countries which have more delegated authority. But I have noticed pretty interesting differences in the degrees to which power is delegated if you watch the politicians in the UK, so if you take the Chancellor, for example, he's saying, I'm releasing this measure. Not Boris Johnson's releasing this measure, I'm releasing this measure. So there's a move to slightly more delegated modes of working there, where there's some nation states that are very just autocratic. There's clearly just single decision makers, or single obvious decision makers. Essentially, we're all under house arrest. So the permissionlessness of the world has just dropped radically, I think it's fair to say. And the degree to which we can self-sustain all this stuff is going to be interesting. And essentially, the world's economic bandwidth has just halved because of this. So yeah, I think it applies. It wasn't built to be intending to apply to nation states, but it kind of does. I don't know what your thoughts on that. Yeah, I think the sort of point around fake news as well. There should be, where we get our information from should be part of this framework as well. Most media outlets and most information is centralized to a high degree, and with that you can corrupt what the outcome is. News is a really good example of something that should be decentralized. I completely agree. The difficulty is that everything gets kind of noisy then, and it's a way of filtering that without keeping the signal to noise. And I do think voting's got a big part to play in that. Does anyone get any other questions? Do drop them into the chat or turn your mics on.
I would say we probably have time for maybe one or two last questions. So speak now. Forever hold your peace. Okay, then I think that's a wrap. Thank you very much, Nick. Oh, sorry. Wait, last one.
Thanks, Yoga. So we're still on nation state systems. I like where this is going. Yeah, national treasury. Yeah, I think if you just look at the way that our national treasuries and the degree to which things are open and transparent, they're not really. What would be the safe amount of funds that you could put on chain? I think this is where governance comes in. We've just seen MakerDAO essentially just fall over. We put far too much trust into a smart contract, and the kind of secondary or even tertiary things that come out through sort of panic events mean that smart contracts can get drained, money can get lost. And I think the interesting thing so that the flash loans thing was quite interesting in that sense, because that was a new tool essentially that was introduced that allowed people to manipulate and run away with funds with a few dollars worth of gas. So what's the safe amount to put in a smart contract is proportional to how much you trust that smart contract and how long it's been sustainable for a long period of time. So yeah, I think that one of the routes into this is governance to roll back negative events. So I know Ethereum, for example, did the DAO fork, and there's been evidence for that. You get a lot more secure around putting money into these digital vaults if you know you can get it back if something goes wrong. Things like the Parity wallet hack, and there's just funds stuck there in limbo. No one's ever going to trust large amounts of money in these things unless they're very sure that's not going to happen. And again, one of the ways out of that is using governance tech to recover things that you don't want to happen, which is this kind of agility bit. So yeah, really good question. Any final questions before we run? I think we're about done. Run out of time.
Well, we have all the time in the world since we're stuck here, but we do have to close it at some point. Thank you very much, Dr. Nick, Almond. I wish to thank our WeWork, of course, to facilitate this as well, and moderators here as well, and of course our attendees for attending first Tezos UK meetup online, which we hope to be the first of many. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night.